July 26, 1845, 74 degrees north, Baffin Bay off the western coast of Greenland. Ice groans against the iron-plated oak hull of HMS Terror, a deep guttural shudder that vibrates through the deck timbers and straight into the boots of every man aboard. At the quarterdeck, Captain Francis Rawdon Moira Crozier pulls his heavy wool collar up against the biting Arctic wind. His pale eyes, weathered by 6 previous polar expeditions, remain fixed on the crystalline labyrinth looming on the horizon. Frost has already begun to crystallize on the brass binnacle, and the air bites at the lungs like swallowed glass. Above him, the rigging shrieks as the wind catches the sails, but underneath that familiar nautical chorus is a distinctly modern sound, the rhythmic, mechanical thumping of a 20-horsepower railway locomotive engine. Below deck, stokers are shoveling Welsh coal into the roaring furnace, driving the heavy brass screw propeller that pushes the Terror through the freezing waters. A thick plume of black coal smoke vomits from the funnel, staining the pristine, blindingly white Arctic sky. A few hundred yards off the starboard bow, cutting through the swells with equal mechanical fury, sails their sister ship, HMS Erebus. Aboard her is the expedition's commander, the aging and affable Sir John Franklin. Together, they represent the absolute pinnacle of British naval engineering. They are not merely ships. They are floating fortresses designed to punch through the roof of the world and finally conquer the elusive Northwest Passage. In the ship's hold below Crozier's boots sits the Empire's hubris. 3 years' worth of provisions for 129 men. There are 32,000 pounds of salted beef, hundreds of gallons of concentrated lemon juice to ward off scurvy, mahogany writing desks, a library of nearly 3,000 books, and 8,000 revolutionary tin cans of preserved meats and soups, hastily sealed with lead solder by a merchant named Stefan Goldner just weeks before departure. They have steam heating coursing through pipes along the lower decks. They believe they have conquered nature itself. "Captain," a voice calls over the wind. It is First Lieutenant Edward Little, his face flushed red from the cold, pointing toward the southeast. The whalers are making their turn. Crozier raises his brass spyglass. Through the lenses he watches the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise. 2 rugged British whaling ships they had encountered earlier that morning. They are turning south, returning to the safety of open waters and the warm hearths of England. Earlier, Crozier had invited Captain Dannett of the Prince of Wales aboard to share a glass of port and hand over the final batch of letters for home. The whalers had stared at the Erebus in terror with a mixture of profound awe and quiet dread. They are the last Europeans the 129 men of the Franklin expedition will ever see. "Let them go, Mr. Little," Crozier murmurs, lowering the glass. He grips the wooden rail, feeling the immense cold seeping through his leather gloves. While the younger officers, like the dashing commander James Fitzjames aboard the Erebus, view this voyage as a grand romantic adventure, Crozier knows better. He knows that the ice is not a static thing. It is a living, breathing predator that cares nothing for Her Majesty's royal commissions or steam engines. The wind shifts, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of the sea turning to slush. Ahead lies Lancaster Sound, the gateway into the uncharted maze of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The waters here are beginning to choke with brash ice, fragments of shattered floes that scrape violently against the Terror's reinforced bow. "Signal from Erebus, sir," the signalman shouts from the halyards, fighting to keep his balance as the ship pitches. Commander Franklin orders course west by north, full steam into the Sound. Crozier tightens his jaw. The summer has been unseasonably cold, and the pack ice is already thicker than it should be for late July. But orders are orders. "Acknowledge the signal," Crozier barks, his voice slicing through the roar of the wind and the thumping engine. "Helm, west by north. Tell the engine room to keep our pressure up." We push through the brash as the Terror alters course, falling into line behind the heavy stern of the Erebus. A dense, freezing fog begins to roll in from the glaciers of Baffin Island. It sweeps over the water like a gray shroud, rapidly swallowing the sunlight. Within minutes, the whaling ships behind them are erased from existence. There is no turning back now. The 129 men are sailing off the edge of the known map, straight into the white darkness. September 12, 1845. 74 degrees 43 north, Beechy Island, Wellington Channel. The sun does not set anymore. It merely skims the horizon like a bloody eye, casting long, eerie shadows across the desolate limestone shores of Beechy Island. The temperature has plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, and the sea is no longer liquid. It is a viscous, gray sludge that thickens by the hour, freezing into solid sheets of pancake ice that lock around the hulls of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Down in the dark, cramped berth deck of the Terror, John Torrington, a 20-year-old stoker, shivers violently despite the steam heat pipes humming against the bulkhead. His throat feels raw, his lungs burn with every breath of coal smoke and stagnant air, and a strange metallic bitterness coats his tongue. He coughs into his hand, staring at the dark sputum in his palm. Outside, the ice is screaming. It is a high-pitched, metallic shriek as the pack forces the two massive ships together, testing the iron-reinforced timbers. On the bleak gravel spit of the island, Captain Crozier stands beside Sir John Franklin, watching a crew of sailors assemble 3 wooden grave markers. The ground is hard as iron, frozen solid by centuries of permafrost. The men have to use picks and gunpowder charges just to dig shallow trenches into the limestone. Torrington didn't make it to the spring. Neither did Private William Brain or able seaman John Hartnell. 3 men lost before we've even found a way south, John. Crozier says quietly, his breath forming thick plumes of white ice in the air. He looks at the fresh mounds of gravel. The men died of respiratory illness. Or so the ship's surgeon, Dr. Stephen Stanley, claims. But Crozier has noticed a growing lethargy among the crew, an unusual irritability that doesn't fit seasoned Royal Navy sailors. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, Francis," Franklin replies, his voice frail but carrying the unshakable optimism of a Victorian gentleman. He pats Crozier's wool-clad shoulder. "We have wintered safely. The ships are unharmed. When the summer thaw comes in July, the ice will open, and we shall sail straight through to the Pacific." Crozier looks away, refusing to let his commander see the deep skepticism in his eyes. He walks over to the island's edge where a massive stack of discarded tin cans sits rusted and bleeding a dull, gray substance into the snow. He picks up a canister of Goldner's preserved meat. The lead solder along the seam is thick, sloppy, and unevenly applied. When he pushes his thumb against the seal, it gives way, releasing a foul, putrid odor of rotting beef. "Mr. Helpman," Crozier calls out to the nearby officer supervising the clearing of the winter camp. "How many of these tins have we thrown out today?" "Nearly half the consignment from the last inspection, sir," the officer replies, his face hollowed out by months of darkness. "The seals are bad. The meat inside is completely spoiled." A cold dread settles deep into Crozier's stomach. It isn't just the spoiled meat that worries him. It is the lead. If the solder is melting into the food during the canning process, they are slowly poisoning themselves. He looks back at the 3 graves. They're simple pine boards standing like sentinels against the barren Arctic expanse. The men aren't just dying of the cold. Something is rotting them from the inside out. By late June, the expected thaw does not arrive. The summer of 1846 brings no warmth, only a relentless gray fog that refuses to lift. The massive ice sheet locking them into Wellington Channel remains unbroken. Sir John, Crozier states firmly during a council of war in the captain's cabin of the Erebus. The air in the room is heavy with the smell of whale oil lamps and damp wool. Maps of the Arctic are spread across the mahogany table, filled with vast, terrifying blank spaces. Wellington Channel is choked. If we remain here, we will be trapped for another winter. We must use the locomotives to push south through Peel Sound. It is our only gamble. Franklin stares at the maps, his fingers tracing the coast of King William Island. He knows the risks. Moving south means entering the blind alley of the Arctic pack, where the ice from the Arctic Ocean is driven by currents directly into the narrow channels, packing into insurmountable walls. "Then south we go, Francis," Franklin says, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. "We will find the passage, or we will carve our names into it." On September 12th, the Erebus and Terror build up full steam pressure, their propellers thrashing the freezing water as they break free from Beachy Island. They steer south, deeper into the uncharted labyrinth, completely unaware that they are sailing directly into a geographic vice that is about to close on them forever. September 12, 1846. 70 degrees 5 north, off the north coast of William Island. The sound is like artillery fire, sharp, deafening cracks that echo across the blinding white desert. But there is no opposing army. It is the sound of the great Arctic pack ice, driven by the relentless northern currents of the Beaufort Sea, slamming into the limestone shoals of King William Island and grinding HMS Erebus and HMS Terror to a violent halt. Reversing engines, full astern. Commander James Fitzjames shouts from the quarterdeck of the Erebus, his voice cracking under the strain. Below deck, the locomotive engine screams, its pistons hammering at maximum pressure. The massive brass propeller thrashes the water into a boiling froth of slush, trying to pull the heavy flagship out of the closing jaws of the floe. It is useless. A mountain of blue pressurized ice, 20 feet high and hard as granite, rises from the sea and rolls over the stern. With a sickening crunch that vibrates through the spine of every man aboard, the rudder is instantly snapped in half. The propeller hits the solid mass, its blades shearing off with a terrifying metallic shriek that resonates through the hold. A mile away, Captain Crozier watches through his spyglass as the Erebus goes dark, her black smoke thinning into the gray sky as the engineers kill the fires. Moments later, the vice closes around the Terror as well. The ice does not merely surround them, it lifts the massive 300-ton ship entirely out of the water, tilting her 5 degrees to starboard. Her timbers groan in agony, the iron reinforcement plates groaning under thousands of tons of lateral pressure. Then, everything goes dead silent. The engines are stopped, the movement ceases. The 2 proudest ships of the Royal Navy are no longer seafaring vessels. They are frozen, helpless monuments stuck fast in an infinite, shifting desert of white ice. "We are beset, Mr. Little," Crozier says quietly, stepping down from the rail. His breath freezes instantly into his thick beard. He looks around at the horizon. In every direction, as far as the eye can see, there is nothing but jagged ridges of ice and snow. They are roughly 15 miles off the coast of a barren, unexplored landmass. "The summer thaw will free us next July, sir," Lieutenant Little says, trying to inject hope into his voice, but his eyes betray his terror. He is looking at the thermometer on the deckhouse. It reads 35 degrees below zero. It is only September. The winter of 1846-1847 becomes a living purgatory. The sun dips below the horizon in November and does not return for nearly 80 days. Darkness swallows the ships. To save coal, the steam heating is shut down, and the lower decks turn into damp, freezing caverns where frost coats the wooden beams. The men huddle around small canvas wick lamps burning foul-smelling seal blubber. Inside the tight berths, a silent killer begins to claim the crew. It starts with a persistent gnawing fatigue and aching joints that the sailors mistake for the effects of the extreme cold. But then come the black, swollen bruises on their legs. Their gums soften, turning spongy and bleeding at the slightest touch. Old wounds, healed decades ago during battles in the Mediterranean or Atlantic, miraculously open up again as their bodies literally dissolve from scurvy. "It makes no sense, Francis," Sir John Franklin whispers one evening in his cabin, his face pale and sunken. He looks at a plate of untouched gray salt beef. "We have the lemon juice. The men are taking their rations daily." Crozier picks up a bottle of the lime juice. He holds it to the dim lamp. The liquid has separated, a thick, dark sediment resting at the bottom, completely ruined by the repeated freezing and thawing cycles. The vitamin C is dead. And worse, the lead from Goldner's tainted tin cans is leaching into their bloodstreams, attacking their central nervous systems. Men begin to mutter to themselves, suffering from paranoid delusions and bouts of unprovoked rage. By May 1847, the darkness lifts, but the ice does not budge. The floes around King William Island are locked tight, held fast by a continuous line of pressure ridges that refuse to melt. On June 11, 1847, the final illusion of British superiority shattered. Sir John Franklin, aged 61, dies in his cabin, his mind addled by lead and his body broken by scurvy. He dies believing that help is just around the corner. Command of the expedition falls entirely upon Captain Francis Crozier. He stands on the ice beside Franklin's canvas-shrouded body as it is lowered into a trench cut directly into the pack ice. As the wind howls across the desolate waste, Crozier looks at the remaining crew. They are hollowed-out ghosts, their lips black, their skin yellowed, their eyes wide with a desperate wild hunger. He knows the truth that Franklin refused to see. The ships will never break free. If they stay here, they will rot in their berths. Their only choice is to abandon the ships and walk into the jaws of the frozen wilderness. April 25, 1848, 69 degrees 37 North, Victory Point, northwest coast of King William Island. The wind howling off the frozen sea carries the sharp, bitter scent of exposed limestone and dying men. Captain Francis Crozier kneels in the frozen gravel of Victory Point, his hands shaking violently within his heavy mittens. Before him sits a rusted cylinder, a standard Royal Navy brass Vanguard canister, which had been cached on this desolate ridge 5 years earlier by a previous exploration party. Inside is a single sheet of Admiralty paper. A year ago, in May 1847, Lieutenant Graham Gore had written a confident, optimistic update on this very page, all well. But now the margins of that same paper are crowded with a frantic, desperate scrawl written in black ink that has begun to fade against the parchment. Crozier dips his pen into a small well of ink kept close to his body heat inside his coat to keep it from freezing solid. He forces his lead-poisoned fingers to write the final, grim truth of the expedition. HMS Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd April, having been beset since 12th Sept 1846. His handwriting slants wildly, reflecting the exhaustion racking his frame. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th June 1847. and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. Crozier stops, coughing violently, a spray of dark blood hitting the snow. He wipes his mouth with a stained sleeve and looks back down at the shoreline. Spread out across the gravel are 105 survivors. They look less like an elite British naval unit, and more like a defeated army retreating through a frozen hell. They have abandoned their ships forever, leaving the Erebus and Terror locked in the death grip of the pack ice 15 miles out to sea. Now they are attempting the impossible, a 1,000-mile march south, toward the nearest Hudson's Bay Company outpost at Backsfish River. Captain, Commander James Fitzjames, breathes heavily as he limps up the ridge, his face blackened by frostbite and eyes bloodshot from snow blindness. The boats are loaded, but the men are collapsing under the weight. Crozier looks down at what the men are dragging. They have mounted the ship's heavy wooden whaleboats onto massive iron-shod oak sledges. Each sledge weighs over 1,200 pounds. Instead of packing only essential survival gear, the men, their minds warped by advanced lead poisoning and severe scurvy, have loaded the boats with heavy, useless luxuries of the Victorian era. There are silver meat covers, heavy iron stoves, collections of pewter plates, silk handkerchiefs, scented soaps, and brass curtain rods. They are dragging the dead weight of the civilization that abandoned them. "We leave nothing behind that can save a life, James," Crozier says, his voice hollow. He rolls up the paper, places it back inside the brass cylinder, and seals it with a lead plug. He buries it beneath a cairn of heavy limestone rocks. It is a message in a bottle left on a desert island of ice, the only official record of what happened to the 129 men that will ever be found. Crozier walks down to the shore and takes his place at the front of the line. The harness of the lead sledge is thrown over his shoulders, the coarse canvas cutting deep into his raw skin. "In the track, men," Crozier commands, his voice swallowed by the gale. "Heave! Heave!" With an agonizing collective groan, the 105 ghosts lean into their harnesses. The heavy wooden runners shriek against the jagged limestone and hard-packed snow. Step by bleeding step, they begin their march south along the western coast of King William Island. They are walking into a geographic trap, moving deeper into the barren lands where no food exists, leaving behind the only warm shelter and medicine they have left. Behind them, the brass cylinder sits silent under the rocks, guarding the secret of their doom. May 24, 1848, 68 degrees 20 North Washington Bay, south coast of King William Island. The line of men has broken. It is no longer a column, but a scattered trail of dying souls stretching for miles across the jagged gray shale and melting slush of the southern coast. The brief Arctic spring has arrived, but it brings no relief, only a blinding, white glare that burns the retinas and turns the ground into a treacherous bog of mud and sharp stone. Lieutenant Edward Little drops to his knees, his hand clawing at the coarse gravel. His boots have long since rotted away, replaced by strips of frozen canvas bound with copper wire. He can no longer feel his toes. They have turned a dead, waxy black from frostbite. Ahead of him, one of the massive 1,200-pound whaleboats sits abandoned, its heavy iron-shod wooden runners sunk deep into the mud. Inside the boat, wrapped in heavy wool blankets that smell of damp and decay, lie 3 sailors. They are not asleep. Their eyes are wide, glassy, and fixed on the pale sky. No one has the strength to bury them. The living simply unhitch themselves from the harness and step over the dead and keep walking. "Get up, Edward," a raspy voice orders. Little looks up to see Captain Crozier standing over him. The captain is unrecognizable. His face is completely blackened by sun and wind, his cheeks hollowed out like a skull, and his jaw locked in a permanent mask of agony. He holds a heavy brass-barreled officer's pistol in one hand, using it like a walking stick to keep his balance against the howling wind. "I can't, sir," Little whispers, his spongy, bleeding gums making his words thick and slurred. "There's nothing left inside me. The tins are all poison." He is right. Along the path of their retreat lie hundreds of discarded Goldner canisters. Desperate for sustenance, the men had used their knives to hack open the remaining meat only to find a putrid black sludge. The lead poisoning has reached its terminal phase. Men are hallucinating, screeching at unseen entities in the snow, their nervous systems completely shattered. Suddenly, a low shout echoes from the front of the line. "Inuit," a sailor cries out, pointing toward a ridge of low hills a quarter-mile inland. Crozier forces his failing eyes to focus. Emerging from the glare are 4 figures dressed in thick seal and caribou skins, hauling a lightweight wooden sled. It is a small hunting party of the Netsilik Inuit. They stop at a distance, watching the grotesque procession of skeletal white men with a mixture of profound shock and caution. To the Netsilik, these men look like spirits risen from the underworld, their skin yellowed, their clothes filthy and torn, their bodies weeping blood. Using the last remnants of his strength, Crozier stumbles forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. He speaks a few words of the Inuit language he learned decades earlier in the eastern Arctic. His voice a desperate, cracking plea. The hunters hesitantly approach. They look inside one of the abandoned whaleboats and recoil in horror. They see men who have begun to do the unthinkable to survive. In the final, madness-induced stages of starvation, the thin veneer of Royal Navy discipline has completely evaporated. The bones of the dead have been sawed and cracked open with axes, their marrow extracted in a desperate, ghoulish bid to stay alive for just a few more hours. The Inuit hunters, realizing they cannot save an army of 100 dying men with their meager winter stores of seal fat and dried fish, offer what little meat they can spare. They trade a small portion of seal blubber for a few silver spoons and a brass button. But as the sun begins to dip, the hunters pack their sledges. They know that to stay near these mad, dying giants is to court starvation themselves. They slip away into the white hills like ghosts. "Don't leave," a sailor screams, firing a heavy Enfield musket wildly into the air. The shot echoes uselessly across the empty tundra. Crozier watches them vanish, his final hope evaporating into the freezing mist. They have reached the southernmost tip of King William Island, a place that future searchers will name Starvation Cove. Across the narrow, ice-choked water of Simpson Strait lies the American continent and Back's Fish River. But between them and salvation lies miles of solid, impassable pack ice. They have run out of land, they have run out of food, and they have run out of time. 69 degrees north, King William Island, the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The white silence of the Arctic is absolute, broken only by the dry, rhythmic clicking of gravel shifting under the boots of Captain Leopold McClintock. For over a decade, Great Britain has sent expedition after expedition to locate her lost sons. The Admiralty offered fortunes. Lady Jane Franklin spent her life's savings. Yet the Arctic kept its secrets locked tight behind a wall of ice. Until now, McClintock, commanding the small search vessel Fox, stops near a low, windswept limestone ridge on the southern shore of King William Island. The summer thaw has been unusually aggressive, stripping away the snowpack to reveal the bare, skeletal spine of the island. There, half buried in the bleak shingle, lies a sight that makes the seasoned explorer freeze in his tracks. It is a human skeleton, bleached as white as the surrounding limestone. Lying face down in the dirt, McClintock kneels beside the remains. The uniform is mostly gone, shredded by a decade of howling blizzards, but fragments of blue cloth and a line of tarnished brass buttons remain stuck to the bone. This was a steward's assistant from the HMS Erebus. The positioning of the body tells a terrible silent story. The man had collapsed mid-stride, falling forward into the mud, and simply never got up. He had died exactly where he fell, his face buried in the gravel, while his comrades kept walking because they lacked the strength to look back. He was crawling toward home, McClintock murmurs, his voice cracking in the still air. As the search party pushes further down the coastline, the horrors of the final march multiply. They find a massive ship's boat mounted on a heavy wooden sledge, the very one Captain Crozier and his men had dragged until their muscles tore. Inside the boat, among an absurd pile of silver flatware, silk neckties, and religious tracts, sit two more skeletons, their bony fingers still clutching loaded muskets aimed at an empty horizon. Miles away at Victory Point, McClintock's second-in-command, Lieutenant William Hobson, discovers the stone cairn containing the brass cylinder. He unscrews the cap, pulls out the Admiralty form, and reads Crozier's frantic, ink-slanted margins from April 8, 1848. The mystery of how they vanished is solved, but the final fate of the survivors remains a lingering ghost. The Inuit oral histories, collected over the subsequent decades, fill in the grim final frames. They tell of a winter when a handful of white men were seen walking south across the ice, their bodies bent double, dropping one by one into the snow. They tell of a final camp near the mouth of the river where the last survivors huddled together in a tent, waiting for a spring that arrived too late. By the time the ice melted, the 129 men of the grandest polar expedition in human history had been entirely erased from the face of the earth. The ships themselves became legends, sinking beneath the ice into the deep, dark vaults of the Arctic Ocean. For 168 years, the Erebus and Terror remained missing, resting in the freezing dark of Queen Maud Gulf and Terror Bay, their exact coordinates guarded by the sea. When marine archaeologists finally located the wrecks in 2014 and 2016, they found them eerily preserved by the near-freezing water. Plates sat neatly stacked in the galley racks. The captain's desk remained locked in his cabin, and the iron-reinforced hulls lay upright on the silt, surrounded by an eternal, frozen dark. The ghost ships of the Arctic had finally been found, resting precisely where the ice had claimed them, serving as silent, sunken tombs for the 129 men who had chased a line on a map and vanished into thin air.